something to you all. I was planning on making a long introduction on this video about how Sonic Adventure is such an influential game, but honestly this game needs no introduction. It's a masterpiece, and since Sonic Frontiers has recently been released, I figured instead of covering that game, it would be cooler to cover the game that inspired it all way back on the Dreamcast in 1998. In this video, I'll be covering the development and prototypes of Sonic Adventure 1, while in the second part, I'll be covering the unused content left in the final game. So let's dive in. Hi everyone, I'm MotoCat, and today, I'm going to talk about the making of Sonic Adventure. After the massive success of the Sega Genesis, Sega were struggling with how to market their 32-bit home console, the Sega Saturn. Now, I won't get into this fiasco too much here due to already covering it on another video, but essentially Sega goofed up the launch in North America and didn't really have enough games ready. One of the franchises that was strangely absent at launch was Sonic the Hedgehog, their most successful franchise up to that point. Sega was working on a Sonic game behind the scenes called Sonic X-treme, but due to the complex nature of the hardware, it was difficult to get through development. In fact, Sonic the Hedgehog programmer Yuji Naka believed the project was doomed from the start, and after seeing the team's prototype running in action, Naka shrugged and said, "Good luck." After numerous delays, Sonic X-treme was cancelled in 1997 in favor of a new game called Sonic RPG. This idea would be scrapped pretty early on in favor of a more straightforward gameplay style, but I can't help but wonder what a Sonic game would look like with this mechanic. Although Sonic Team would briefly work on the Saturn with their new 3D Sonic game, they ended up moving on to a newer console development in the process, more powerful than any other console on the market, codenamed Katana. This console would later become the Dreamcast, and all the progress that they had made on the Saturn would be incorporated into the Sonic World Open Zone level in Sonic Jam, one of the final first-party titles for the Sega Saturn. That would be the first look at the game the public had, but the team would begin finalizing the basic plan for the game shortly after on the Dreamcast. During the early development of the game on the Saturn, the team took several screenshots. These appear to use backgrounds from Nights into Dreams, another Sonic Team development on the Saturn being made around the same time. These are pretty interesting considering the fact that they don't really use any assets that we see in the final game. Before the development of Sonic Adventure, the team would travel to America and find inspiration for the game. The team would go from the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico all the way down to Peru in South America. They took several photos with a digital camera and even used cropped versions of some of their photos as textures in the final game. Though it wasn't all fun, the group had their fair share of encounters with snakes, spiders, and one of the team members kept collapsing repeatedly due to altitude sickness. But it would be alright in the end, and Sonic Team came back to Japan full of ideas and motivation for Sonic Adventure. Yuji Yukawa, a Japanese artist who had previously worked on designs for other Sonic Team games like Sonic 3D Blast, Sonic R, and Ristar. Please don't get mad at me for mispronouncing that, I seriously looked that up and that's how it's supposed to be pronounced. Would redesign the Sonic characters for a more modern appearance inspired by street art and graffiti with the supervision of Naoto Oshima, the original creator of Sonic the Hedgehog. A goal for the creators was to have new gameplay styles and multiple stories to choose from. The two new characters to the series were E102 Gamma, Tikal, and Big the Cat. Tikal is an echidna similar to Knuckles, who belongs to the ancient Echidna tribe. Gamma was Sonic Team's response to fan demands for a character to have a shooting mechanic. Feeling it would be unfitting and unnatural for one of the characters to wield a gun, the team would decide to create a mech who would shoot things with a built-in laser gun. Big was a way to balance out the more intense gameplay styles of the other 5 characters. The final lineup for the characters would be Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Amy, Gamma, and Big. Also in the gameplay were some basic mini-games that could be played to further progress in the story. Sky Chase was one of the earliest to be conceived by the team and can be seen in those early Sega Saturn screenshots we saw. One of these was Sand Hill, a minigame that initially wasn't a part of the plan, but after the team saw sandboarding in Peru, they were floored and felt like they had to include it in the game. In Takashi Iizuka's words,
"While we were in Peru, we noticed some people boarding on sand dunes. We were so impressed with this, we had no idea this kind of sport actually existed. It was so new and exciting for us to see this. We knew that we had to add this element to our game, and we figured that Tails, if anyone, was the most appropriate character to use."
The main villain of the story, Dr. Eggman, was a reoccurring character from the older games. But this time, he had a bit of a name change. See, he was always called Eggman in Japan, but up to this point, in America, he was called Robotnik. Sega of Japan made the move to finally keep his name the same across all regions. Chaos was a new introduction to the series as a mythical creature with a cool, clear blue design, but in reality, it was sort of Sega just flexing their hardware. See, the Dreamcast was the first 128-bit console, double the power of the Nintendo 64 easily. So with their launch title, they wanted to have a big bad that would show off the capabilities of the hardware while also having enough substance to the story that it would actually have a point to exist. The earliest two screenshots of the game on the Dreamcast are dated December 9th, 1997, and it appears these shots are of a very early Windy Valley. The two shots were used to test the GD-ROM functionality of the Dreamcast. In May 1998, this photo was leaked around the time of E3 1998. Although this screenshot is insanely blurry, we can definitely tell this stage was quite different even this far into development. Most notably, the lighting of the stage seems quite different, with a much more dark and ambient lighting. Although I prefer this, imagine how difficult it would be to play this, especially on the newer TVs of today with darker exposure. We can clean this up a bit in the photo editor and see more of what this image really looks like. Unfortunately, it's still quite grainy, but what do you expect from old magazine ads? Here's the unedited May 98 shot next to the standard release from later that year, and yeah, you can definitely see some differences. The next ones are sourced from an unknown French website. These are from around 1 to 2 months after we got the modes in May, and we can see that these four mostly just have different lighting. Fun fact, this appears to be the first time the public saw perfect chaos. SPEEPSHighway finally looks playable, Ice Cap has different lighting and opaque icicles, and Red Mountain has different lighting as well as Sonic using higher quality textures than the build in the final game. The next look we had at the game was actually a full video demo from the game's reveal in August 1998 at the Tokyo International Forums, with around 30 minutes of beta footage and interviews. I'll just be going over the beta footage, however. Unfortunately, we've got a lot to go over here, so I won't be able to put everything in this video, but if you're interested, check out the cutting room floor page for the game, link in description. Here are a bunch of major differences in the demo. We're just going to go through these really quick. Alright, so number one is, this build runs at 60 FPS while the final runs at 30 FPS. The game uses a method of slimming itself down known as backface culling, which basically means you can't see geometry when it's viewed from the back. All the normally differently colored E100 robots just use Gamma's model. The build uses an early jump animation from Sonic Jam for all the characters. The Sonic Team logo is radically different from the final. Jump panels look quite different in this build too. Item boxes don't spin at all. Knuckles can be seen doing an uppercut attack that, although removed in this game, was rebuilt and can be used in Sonic Adventure 2. There are no models for character upgrades. Switches have a different design with a green cap instead of the final's white one. The lighting is much more realistic and dynamic in this build, which was cut from the final to keep it running at a more consistent frame rate. And finally, Knuckles can be seen digging anywhere in this build, while in the final he is restricted to only certain textures. One difference in the opening action stage, Emerald Coast, is that the iconic whale section has no dash panels and that there aren't any checkpoints. In Windy Valley, all the 1,500 objects have different animations, while in the final game there are only 1,024 objects and only some have animations. This was most likely changed due to performance issues on the hardware. Twinkle Park is entirely different in this build, and Big the Cat can be seen in it, though in the final game this is not one of his levels that he can access. In SPEEPSHighway, Tails is still seen using Sonic's layout. The lighting is much darker than the final, like we saw in those early screenshots, and many placeholder objects are used, such as bricks instead of floors. There's no glass when Sonic enters the building, and there are many odd elements here too, such as clocks in pits. In Red Mountain, Knuckles is shown in Sonic's act instead of his own. The stage uses a different skybox, more complex particle effects, different textures, and several missing objects. Lost World only has a couple of differences, with one being the fact that Knuckles is in this act, despite not appearing in the level in the final game, and the fire in Act 3 producing light. Ice Cap has tons of dead trees that are nowhere to be found in the final game. The camera movement is different, and Tails' arm has some, issues. Might want to get that checked out, bud. Final Egg and Gamma's part only has Sonic dolls instead of multiple characters, and in other characters' parts there's an entrance at the beginning that was blocked off in the final. In the Sky Chase Act 1 minigame, there's actually a dragon with full functionality. The reason this is interesting is because this dragon, although completely broken and without programming in the final game, is still in the final game's files and can be placed in object placement mode. The Chaos Zero boss fight has tons of camera differences, as well as much more decor than in the final game. Station Square's City Hall building is a bit different too, with a taller building and a more elaborate gate design. Oddly, in the Egg Carrier Hub, there are quite a few palette differences, as well as some different lighting and effects. The Tornado 2 is shown completely intact in this cutscene, and Sonic has additional mouth movement after the Chaos 6 boss fight that doesn't match up to any of the initial Japanese voiceover, and the character select in this build is different too, and is actually still present in the final version's files. And lastly, a demo of Open Your Heart, the game's theme, plays throughout the video. Take a listen. The next bit of footage we have is from the LunarNet website, and it has a few interesting differences. The early character select is shown here, but even more different than the Tokyo International Forums demo, as it only shows Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles. SPEEPSHighway has some extra objects and differences too. The rest of the footage is just from the Tokyo International Forums, however. There's a trailer that says the game is 50% complete, which is a lie, and in fact the game is much further into development. And lastly, here's some Dreamcast US magazine footage that shows that Emerald Coast Whale section finally has dash panels. Let's get into the prototypes. The first prototype is the Auto Demo prototype from 1998, which was set out to Japanese retailers. Firstly, if you don't know what an auto demo is, it's essentially a build of the game that plays itself. It's the same idea as if you wait too long on a title screen and the game plays a demo. This is the only prototype we currently have dated before the Japanese release in 1998, and as such, it's the one with the biggest changes. Now, there are lots and lots of smaller differences here too, and I obviously can't go over everything, but if you'd like to do some independent research, head on over to that cutting room floor link I mentioned earlier, link in description. Firstly, let's start with the test levels left in by developers. We can pretty easily see that these were used to test the functionality of different moves, mostly from Sonic or Tails' moveset, though these could be at least used to test other characters too. Here's some video of them functioning in a hacked version of the auto demo. These are a bit like the test stages from Sonic Adventure 2, which have a similar format. Next up, let's take a look at the early version of Emerald Coast featured in this build. The first thing you'll notice is that Sonic starts in a different position, and that the camera is at a different angle. The lighting is much less dynamic than the finals, and the loop-de-loop section is at a different camera angle. The stage is missing several enemies and objects, and this area right here with platforms and water is entirely empty. It's funny, this stage feels like an alternate universe version of this build. Maybe that's because of how many times I've played it. Anyways, the island at the end is totally empty for some reason, and thus there seems to be no way to complete it. Big's version of the stage is also a bit different, with some blacked off areas that have presumably not been finished yet. Next, let's move on to Windy Valley, and my god does this one have some crazy changes. Interestingly enough, that prototype version from the Tokyo International Forum still exists in the files, albeit only partially intact. The correct textures are missing, but you can pretty clearly see the level design in these photos is different. Numerous objects are present intended for this stage, but it's so sad we can't get to play the beta Windy Valley. Well, lucky for us, fans came to the rescue with a mod for Sonic Adventure that brings back the old Windy Valley. If you're interested in trying this out, the link is in the description. I could spend all day talking about the early version of this stage considering how different it is, but unfortunately, I don't have all day, so let's move on to Casinopolis. This version of the game features a slightly earlier version of the level with minor changes to the layout, along with a bar model that doesn't appear to be in the final game. The Sonic Pinball area is only slightly different, while the Knights Pinball stage is quite different from the final game with a more curved table. This screenshot details an early test version of the pinball minigames that is actually quite similar to this prototype. Next we're going to move on to Ice Cap. In this early screenshot, Ice Cap has this bridge which is actually accessible in this photo. Also, the general feel is more wooden as it has many more decorations. Once again, more minor differences, added and removed objects, and changed camera angles. The dead trees are still here from that Tokyo International Forums footage, and the end of the stage is much more simple than the final. SPEEPSHighway has numerous differences, the most striking being the beginning of the stage, which has a lower ceiling and different cosmetics. The final part of the stage is extremely different from the final game, with lots of little changes that add up pretty quickly. One of these is that iconic wall curve from the opening of Act 3. It looks very odd in this version of the game and appears to be missing textures. There's also no checkpoint at the beginning of this act. The stage seems a lot more open in this build than the final, and I actually sort of prefer Act 3 from the auto demo. Next we got Red Mountain Men. This one might be the most unfinished. No lighting, broken camera, numerous different textures, and this bridge, which is unnaturally red in this build. There's a lot of different layouts, but everything is roughly the same in terms of the base stage. Knuckles' version of the stage is basically the same as the build from the Tokyo Game Show, with numerous layout differences and some booth rings. The next one we have is Lost World. Not that one. At the beginning of the level, there's this open ceiling that was covered up in the final game for whatever reason. I feel like a broken record saying this, but there were some layout changes and some different lighting in this build. The snake room is entirely different and has a totally different way to get to the puzzle. In the dark room, the mirrors aren't present yet. There are extra enemies, the layout of the light puzzle is quite different, and there are lots of missing rings throughout the stage. This is the final stage we have to go over in this prototype, Final Egg. This one is by far the most unfinished, with missing music in every act other than the first. Tons of missing objects, misplaced objects, incorrect starting point, a duller overall appearance, as well as Act 2 looking completely different. Acts 2 and 3 are missing several objects, and it's pretty clear that the style of the stage was just not fleshed out yet. The only act of Twinkle Circuit is this weird unfinished layout that doesn't match any of the acts in the final, as well as lacking rings, item boxes, music, and textures. Though Twinkle Park is in this build, it's normally inaccessible due to missing files. Skydeck, though also here, is barely changed from what I can tell. Unfortunately, textures are missing for the station square geometry, but we can see some differences, like the Cybernet building being significantly taller than it is in the vinyl, and the hotel having a giant hotel sign above it. The Mystic Ruins is basically the same as the final, with a couple little changes that really aren't worth going over here. The egg carrier seems to be the closest to being finished, with some differences in lighting and level geometry, and largely missing items. Now, we're all done with level differences. Phew, finally. Next, let's take a look at the graphical differences of this demo and the final build. Firstly, we have some mission card graphics. Most of these are just rephrased versions of the finals text, like using break instead of destroy, etc. But one stood out to me in particular, which is this one for Big's mission. Fish for and catch your friend Froggy. But in this build it says, go fishing for your friend Frog, which is just funny to me for some reason. Honestly, some of the demo's mission cards are more clearly worded than the finals, oddly. There's these lifebox icons that have been switched a different way, which means I can make them dance by switching between them in a photo viewer. But don't let me get bored. The HUD is a bit different in this demo, with a couple things being moved around and a level part that isn't in the final, and Big's HUD is missing several things from the final version. The prototype's distress icon for Chow are quite different and much more unpolished. The billboard advertisement for Chow in Space is an advertisement for The Man 3 in this build, which can be seen in the final in Tails' Eggwalker boss fight, but was removed entirely from the DX part of the game on GameCube, among many other things. The pause menu uses this earlier, more simplistic design, which I actually like a little bit more, as well as these unused start and goal things that are actually the earliest files in the game, dated back to November 11th, 1997. There's about 30 audio files in this build, but some are never heard for whatever reason. Several of these have been changed, and though I can't go over all of them, I'm going to go through some. Firstly, the title screen plays this shorter loop of the Open Your Heart loop. The Chow Garden theme has loads more percussion, which is mixed higher in the song. And lastly, Speed Highway is a few BPM faster. Sonic's action pose is a bit different in the auto demo. The orbs you see when he charges up the light dash are much brighter. The picking up objects functionality has not been fully implemented yet, and as such is quite buggy. Tails is missing his tired animation for flying, and Knuckles' gliding sound continues after he lands. Amy's hammer has no sound yet. Genesis era sounds are used for breathing in an air bubble, getting hurt, or dying, and the opponent Sonic in Tails' ice cap doesn't speak. Chow are much more simplistic in their behavior in this version, as they don't move around until they're approached by the player. They constantly say chow chow, they don't recognize water and run around in it like land, and chow slide very far when thrown. I'm a little scared to meet whoever set out on testing that. The rocket platform in the auto demo is different, jump panels were changed significantly, and many other objects are missing functions, such as the capsule, which doesn't release animals. There are some debug tools like a level select in this debug menu. The title screen of the Tokyo Game Show version can be found in the game's files along with an early character select screen. English versions of the Tokyo Game Show tutorials can be found in the files that go unused in all builds of the game. And finally, for this build, we have this unused wallpaper that is only accessible on the Sega of Japan website. The auto demo will be the only pre-Japanese release version of the game, which means that the 4 other prototypes of the game are mostly for the international versions of the game. The Japanese release will be on December 23rd, 1998, and the next prototype we have to look at is from March 1999, and it's called the Taikenbon version of the game, and my apologies if I mispronounced that. Don't get your hopes up for some major changes though, as this is just the Japanese version limited to a short portion of the game, with parts made easier. Next we have Sonic Adventure Limited Edition, which was available at Hollywood video rental stores in mid-1999. This one has a build date of June 3rd, 1999, and is the first version of the game that we got in America. The biggest difference in this build is that the lip sync for the English translation hasn't been implemented yet, which leads to cutscenes being very out of sync. The internet settings in this version aren't here yet, and if the player attempts to access the Sonic Adventure homepage, they will instead be shown an advertisement for the website. The next prototype we have is from E3 1999, which was a huge event for Sega, as it was the first time the Dreamcast was revealed in the West. The only thing majorly different about this prototype is one huge thing. Knuckles' voice is different. His voice of the prototype is more thick and gruff than the final. Here, take a listen.
Adventure mode. Start your adventure here.
Adventure mode. Start your adventure here.
And the final prototype we'll be looking at has a build date of July 8th, 1999, 2 months away from the final North American release date of September 9th, 1999. The only real difference here is that the lip sync isn't finished yet still, and that the entire story is cut short to Emerald Coast. Bottles for other levels can be found in the code, but as they are missing textures, they're basically inaccessible in the correct way. And that should be it for today. If you want to learn more about the development of Sonic Adventure, head on over to the cutting room floor, link in description. Part 2 should be coming out in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for it. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.